The day my husband told me he was leaving, I had just come home from 12 hours at the office with a container of leftover pasta and a plan to watch something mindless on the couch until I fell asleep. I remember the pasta specifically because I set it down on the kitchen counter when I walked in and I never picked it up again that evening, and it was still sitting there the next morning when I came downstairs after a night of not sleeping, a small ordinary detail that had somehow survived the complete reorganization of everything around it. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. Not on the couch, not in his usual place in front of the television after a long day, but at the table, upright, with his hands folded in front of him in a way that told me before he said a single word that this was not an ordinary evening and that whatever was about to happen had been prepared for, rehearsed maybe, decided some time ago and only now being delivered. He told me he was leaving. He told me he had fallen in love with someone else. He told me her name was Caroline. Caroline was my best friend. She had been my best friend for 12 years, since the first week of college when we had been assigned to neighboring dorm rooms and had stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about everything and nothing the way you do when you are 18 and the world is entirely new and you do not yet understand that some of the people you let in closest are the ones who will eventually cost you the most. I stood in my kitchen holding my work bag with the container of leftover pasta on the counter behind me, and I looked at my husband of 6 years and I did not say anything for a long time. Not because I had nothing to say. Because there was so much to say that none of it could find its way out first. My name is Sophia Carter. I am 31 years old. I am a business strategist, which means I spend my professional life analyzing situations, identifying the variables that matter most, and building plans that account for outcomes most people do not see coming until they are already inside them. I am good at my job. I am good at it in the particular way that people are good at things they were built for, where the skill and the person are so aligned that the work feels less like effort and more like expression. I was not good, it turned out, at seeing what was happening in my own home. The variables I had missed were the ones closest to me, which is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about the particular blindness that love produces in otherwise perceptive people. This is the story of what I built in the 2 years after Daniel left, and what happened on the afternoon he walked into a meeting room and found me sitting on the other side of the table as the new owner of the company he had spent 6 years telling me was his dream. But before that afternoon, I need to tell you about Daniel and Caroline and the particular shape of what I lost and what I found in the losing of it. The marriage. Daniel and I met at a work event 7 years before he sat down at that kitchen table. He was in sales at a tech company, charming and confident in the way that certain men are charming and confident, the kind that fills a room easily and makes everyone in it feel slightly more alive. I was attracted to that quality immediately, and I spent the next 6 years slowly understanding that a quality which fills a room is not the same as a quality that sustains a life. We were good together in the ways that are visible. We traveled well. We had the same taste in restaurants and the same threshold for social events and the same preference for Sunday mornings spent quietly rather than dramatically. We had built a life together that looked, from the outside, like exactly what it was supposed to look like. What we did not have, and what I understood only after he was gone, was the kind of honesty that goes below the surface of a shared life into the actual interior of two people. Daniel did not tell me when he was unhappy. He did not tell me when something was missing or when he felt the distance between us growing in the way that distances grow when two people are very busy and very comfortable and have stopped asking each other the real questions. He simply let it grow, quietly, until it was large enough to accommodate someone else. That someone else was Caroline. Caroline and I had been close in the way that certain female friendships are close, built on years of shared history and the particular intimacy of having witnessed each other through multiple versions of ourselves. She had been at our wedding. She had been the person I called when things were hard at work or when Daniel and I had argued about something I needed to process out loud. She had sat across from me at dinners and holiday gatherings and Sunday brunches for 12 years, and she had looked at my husband across those tables, and she had decided, at some point I cannot identify precisely, that what she felt was worth more than what we had built together. I do not know when it started. I stopped trying to calculate it sometime in the second month after Daniel left, because calculating it produced nothing useful and cost me sleep I could not afford to lose. The divorce was handled through lawyers because Daniel and I could not manage to be in the same room together without the conversation becoming something neither of us could control. We had shared savings, a jointly owned apartment, and the particular financial entanglement of two people who had believed, when they combined their lives, that the combination was permanent. The settlement was fair in the legal sense, which is a different thing from feeling fair in the human sense. Daniel took half of our shared savings, which amounted to roughly $90,000. I kept the apartment, which I sold 6 months later because living in it alone felt less like home and more like a daily inventory of everything that had changed. I took my half of the savings, added the proceeds from the apartment sale, and moved into a smaller place closer to my office that cost me less each month and gave me, for the first time in 6 years, a life that was entirely and only mine to manage. The 2 years. I want to tell you about the 2 years honestly, because I think it would be easy to present them as a clean upward arc, a montage of a woman rebuilding herself with quiet determination, and while that is not entirely untrue, it is also not the whole picture. The first 6 months were hard in ways I had not fully prepared for. Not because of Daniel specifically, though there were moments when that particular grief arrived unexpectedly and with force. Hard because of Caroline, because the loss of a 12-year friendship occupies a different and in some ways more disorienting space than the end of a marriage. A marriage ending has a shape, a legal and social framework, a word for what you are afterward. The end of a friendship of that depth has no equivalent vocabulary and no established process, and you are left to find your own way through it without any of the structures that exist to help people through the other kind of loss. I went to therapy. I say that plainly because I think it matters and because I am not interested in the version of this story where the protagonist rebuilds herself entirely through her own internal resources without any outside help. The therapist I found was a woman who had a way of asking questions that made you hear your own answers differently, and what I began to hear, over several months of those questions, was that I had spent 6 years in a marriage and 12 years in a friendship, both of which had required me to be smaller than I actually was, to manage my own competence carefully so that the people around me did not feel outpaced by it. I had been making myself smaller for a very long time. I had not understood it as shrinking because I had been doing it so gradually and so naturally that it had become invisible to me. I stopped shrinking in the second month of therapy. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulating way that real changes happen, one small decision at a time, each one slightly larger than the one before it. At work I stopped softening my analysis when I thought the room might find it uncomfortable. I stopped arriving at my own conclusions and then presenting them as questions so that other people could feel like they had reached them first. I stopped being careful about being too much and started simply being what I was, which turned out to be considerably more than I had been allowing anyone to see. My career, in those 2 years, moved faster than it had in the previous 4 combined. And the money I had taken from the settlement and the apartment sale, sitting in accounts I was now managing with the full attention of someone who no longer had a shared life to maintain, was doing something I had not entirely planned for. It was growing. Daniel had talked about Meridian Solutions for as long as I had known him. Not every day, not in the obsessive way that some people talk about their ambitions until the people around them grow tired of hearing about them. He talked about it the way certain people talk about the thing they want most, occasionally, and with a specific quality of longing that makes the listener understand this is not an idle wish but something the person has organized a significant portion of their interior life around. Meridian was a mid-sized business consulting firm that had been founded 20 years earlier by a man named Gerald Holt, who had built it into something genuinely respected in its field before his health began to decline in ways that made the daily demands of ownership increasingly difficult to manage. Daniel had worked with Meridian on a contract basis twice during our marriage. Both times he had come home from those projects with a particular energy I recognized as the kind that only arrives when someone is doing something that feels exactly right. He talked about the firm's culture, its client relationships, the quality of the work, the reputation Holt had built over 2 decades. He talked about what he would do with it if it were ever his, the directions he would take it, the clients he would pursue, the team he would build around it. I had listened to all of this with genuine interest because at the time I was his wife and his ambitions were things I cared about in the direct and uncomplicated way that you care about the ambitions of someone you have built your life around. After the divorce I did not think about Meridian Solutions for a long time. There was no reason to. It was a piece of a life I was no longer living and the mental real estate it had occupied was needed for other things. I heard about the sale from a colleague named James who had no idea about my history with Daniel and no idea that the name Meridian Solutions meant anything personal to me at all. He mentioned it in passing over lunch 8 months into my second year post-divorce, the way people in our industry mention relevant market news, as information rather than story. Gerald Holt had finally decided to step back entirely. The firm was being formally listed for acquisition. The asking price was significant but not, James said, unreasonable given the client base and the revenue history. I kept my face completely neutral and asked a few professional-sounding questions and finished my lunch and went back to my office and sat at my desk for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think the honest version is more interesting than the clean one. What I felt was not immediately strategic. It was not a fully formed plan arriving complete and ready to execute. What I felt first was something much more simple and much more human, which was that the universe had just placed in front of me something that I had the means and the expertise to take hold of, something that had once been talked about across my own kitchen table as belonging to someone else's future, and the question of whether I was going to reach for it or let it pass was one I understood I would be answering for myself for a very long time either way. I reached for it. The research. I spent 3 weeks doing what I do professionally, which is analyzing a situation with complete rigor before committing to a position. I pulled everything publicly available on Meridian Solutions, financials, client retention rates, staff tenure, market position, competitive landscape, growth trajectory over the previous 5 years. I had 2 conversations with people in my professional network who had worked with the firm directly, framed as general industry interest rather than acquisition research. I built a financial model that showed me, with as much precision as I could achieve from the outside, what the firm was actually worth versus what it was being listed for and what it could be worth under optimized management. The numbers were good. Not just good in the sense of a reasonable investment. Good in the sense that someone with my specific background in business strategy was genuinely positioned to do something significant with this particular asset. The fit between what I did and what Meridian needed was not something I manufactured to justify a decision I had already made emotionally. It was something I found in the analysis and had to sit with carefully precisely because the emotional dimension was also present and I needed to be certain I was not letting one contaminate the other. After 3 weeks I was certain. The acquisition made sense on its own terms, independent of everything it meant personally. If Daniel had never existed and I had never heard the name Meridian Solutions before James mentioned it over lunch, I would still have looked at those numbers and seen an opportunity worth pursuing. That clarity mattered to me. I did not want to spend significant money and significant energy on something whose primary logic was personal. I wanted the personal dimension to be a detail, a piece of context, not the foundation. The foundation was solid. The personal dimension was simply something that made the solid foundation considerably more interesting. I contacted a mergers and acquisitions lawyer I had worked with professionally on client matters, a woman named Sandra who was thorough and discreet and who I trusted completely to handle the process with the seriousness it required. I told her I was interested in pursuing the Meridian acquisition. I told her my budget, which combined my settlement funds, the apartment proceeds, 2 years of aggressive personal investment returns, and a modest amount of outside financing I had arranged through a private lender I had a long-standing relationship with. Sandra told me the numbers were workable. She told me the process would take time and that there would likely be competing interest from other parties and that I should be prepared for a negotiation that required patience. I told her patience was something I had a great deal of experience with. The negotiation. The acquisition process took 4 months from my first formal expression of interest to the signing of final documents. There were 2 other serious bidders. One was a larger consulting group looking to absorb Meridian into an existing portfolio of firms, the kind of acquisition that would have changed the firm's culture and client relationships in ways that Gerald Holt, even in stepping back, found uncomfortable. The other was a private equity group whose interest was primarily financial rather than operational, which raised concerns for Holt about what would happen to the team he had spent 20 years building. I was the third option, and I understood from my first conversation with Holt's representatives that being the third option was not a disadvantage in this particular situation. What Holt wanted was someone who understood the work, who had genuine expertise in the field, who cared about the firm's reputation and its people rather than simply its revenue potential. He had built something he was proud of, and he was looking for someone who would be a steward of that rather than simply an acquirer of it. I had a conversation with Holt himself midway through the process, a 2-hour meeting in his office that was the most important 2 hours of the entire negotiation. I came prepared with specific ideas about the firm's direction, specific observations about areas where I saw growth potential, specific thoughts about the team structure and the client relationships and the market positioning. I did not come with a vision for changing everything. I came with a vision for taking what was already good and making it sustainably excellent. Holt listened to all of it carefully. He asked good questions. At the end of the 2 hours he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he appreciated that I understood the difference between a firm and a transaction. Sandra called me 3 weeks later to tell me our offer had been accepted. I sat in my office after that call with the door closed for about 10 minutes, not doing anything, just sitting with it, the way I have learned to sit with significant moments before the practical demands of them arrive and there is no more time for simply feeling what they mean. Then I opened my laptop and started building the transition plan. I did not tell anyone outside of Sandra and my private lender that the acquisition was complete until the paperwork was fully signed and the ownership transfer was legally recorded. Not my colleagues. Not my family. Not anyone I knew socially who might, through the ordinary channels of conversation and connection, allow the information to reach someone I was not yet ready to have receive it. Daniel still worked in the industry. We had mutual professional contacts, the inevitable overlap of two people who had shared a life in the same field for 6 years. I understood that the news would reach him eventually, that there was no version of this where he did not find out that I had bought the firm he had spent years describing as his dream. What I had not planned, and what Sandra mentioned almost as an afterthought 2 days after the signing, was that Meridian had an existing relationship with Daniel's current employer, a sales partnership that had been in place for 3 years and that included quarterly review meetings between senior representatives from both organizations. The next quarterly meeting was scheduled for 6 weeks after my ownership transfer was complete. Daniel's name was on the attendee list. Sandra asked if I wanted her to flag the conflict and suggest rescheduling. I thought about it for a moment. I told her to leave it on the calendar. The morning of the quarterly review I arrived at the office 45 minutes before anyone else. I do this regularly, not as a performance of diligence but because the early morning hours in an office are the ones that belong entirely to you, before the day fills with other people's needs and priorities and the ambient noise of a workplace in motion. I made coffee in the small kitchen off the main corridor. I sat at the desk in the corner office that was now mine, Gerald Holt's desk, a large solid piece of furniture that still had the particular smell of a room that has been occupied by the same careful person for 20 years, and I looked at the city through the window and I thought about nothing specific for a little while. I had prepared for this meeting the way I prepare for all of them, thoroughly and without drama. The agenda was straightforward. A review of the existing sales partnership, discussion of performance metrics from the previous quarter, forward planning for the next 6 months. I knew the material completely. I had reviewed the partnership history going back 3 years, understood the terms and the performance against those terms and the areas where I believed the relationship could be structured more effectively going forward. I had not prepared specifically for Daniel because there was nothing specific to prepare. He was an attendee at a business meeting. I was the person running it. Everything else was personal history, and personal history, in my experience, is something you place somewhere quiet before you walk into a room and retrieve only after you have walked out of it again. I was ready by the time the first members of my own team began arriving at 8:30. I greeted them the way I always greet people, directly and without excessive warmth or excessive formality, the particular register I have found works best in professional settings where people need to feel both respected and clear about where they stand. The representatives from Daniel's firm were scheduled to arrive at 10. At 9:58 my assistant knocked on the open door of my office and told me the visitors had arrived and were being shown to the main conference room. I finished the paragraph I was reading, closed the document, stood up, and walked down the corridor. The room. I heard his voice before I opened the conference room door. He was talking to someone on his team, something about the drive over, something ordinary, and his voice had the same easy confident quality it had always had, the room-filling quality I had once found so immediately attractive and had spent considerable time, in the year after he left, learning to remember accurately rather than either idealizing or diminishing. I opened the door and walked in. There were 4 people on his side of the table. Daniel was second from the left. He was looking down at his phone when I entered, and he looked up the way people look up when a door opens, automatically, without expectation. I watched his face go through several things in rapid succession. Recognition first, the immediate involuntary kind that the body produces before the mind has caught up. Then confusion, the specific confusion of a person encountering something their brain cannot immediately file correctly because it belongs to a category they were not prepared for. Then something else, something I did not try to name precisely because naming it would have required more attention than I was prepared to give it in that moment. I had 4 people on my side of the table. I sat at the head of it. I set my materials down and I looked at the room and I said good morning to everyone and thanked them for coming in. I did not acknowledge the history directly. I did not catch his eye in a way that invited a private exchange inside a professional setting. I did not give him anything that was not available to everyone else in the room equally, which is to say I gave him exactly what the situation called for, which was my complete professional attention and nothing more and nothing less. I ran the meeting the way I run all of them. We covered the agenda items in order. I had observations about the previous quarter's performance that were specific and well supported. I had questions about their side of the partnership that were genuine and precisely targeted. I had proposals for the next 6 months that reflected a clear understanding of what the relationship could accomplish if structured slightly differently than it had been under the previous ownership. His team responded well. They were professional and prepared, and the conversation was substantive in the way that good business conversations are substantive, where the people involved are actually thinking rather than simply representing positions. Daniel said very little for the first 40 minutes. When he did speak, his voice was measured and his contributions were relevant, and he gave no indication to anyone else in that room that anything unusual was occurring. I respected that. Whatever else was true about him, he was not someone who made professional situations personal in public, and neither was I, and the meeting was the better for it. At the end of the formal agenda, I thanked everyone and outlined the next steps and the timeline for follow-up. People began gathering their materials. Conversations broke into smaller clusters the way they do at the end of a meeting when the formal structure dissolves and people allow themselves to be slightly more human with each other. His colleagues moved toward the door. He stayed at the table. The conversation. I did not leave the room either. My team filed out with the natural ease of people who understood that their presence was no longer needed without being told. Sandra had briefed them that I might want a few minutes with the visiting team at the end, framed as standard relationship building with a new partnership under new ownership, which was true enough that no one questioned it. When the room was empty except for the 2 of us, he looked at me for the first time the way he had not allowed himself to look at me during the meeting, directly and without the professional filter in place. He said my name. I said hello, Daniel. He asked how long I had known about the meeting. I told him Sandra had mentioned his name was on the attendee list 2 days after the acquisition was finalized. I told him I had chosen to leave it on the calendar. He asked why. I thought about that question for a moment before I answered it, not because I did not know the answer but because I wanted to give him the true one rather than the easy one. I told him because the partnership was legitimate and the meeting was legitimate and I was not interested in reorganizing my professional life around avoiding him. I told him I had bought Meridian because the numbers made sense and because I was genuinely the right person to run it, and that those 2 things were true regardless of everything else, and I was not going to pretend otherwise by treating a quarterly review as something I needed to hide from. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it was a good acquisition. He said it without any apparent difficulty, which surprised me slightly, and I think my surprise must have been visible because he said he meant it, that he had followed the firm for years and understood what it was worth, and that what I had done with the financing structure, which had apparently reached him through industry channels in the weeks since the announcement, was genuinely impressive. I thanked him. I meant it the way you mean a professional compliment from someone whose judgment in a specific area you respect regardless of everything else. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. Better than well, actually, in the ways that matter most, which I said not to wound him but because it was simply true, and I had reached the point where saying true things about my own life did not require careful calibration against his feelings. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at me. He said he was sorry. Not for the meeting, not for anything specific in that room. Just sorry, the way people say it when they mean the larger thing and do not have a more precise word for it. I told him I appreciated that. I told him it had taken me some time but that I was genuinely all right and that I did not need him to carry the weight of that anymore, which was its own kind of release, I think, for both of us. We shook hands at the door of the conference room the way two professionals shake hands at the end of a meeting that went well. His grip was the same as it had always been. Firm and brief and certain. Mine was too. I walked back to my office. I sat at Gerald Holt's desk, my desk, and I looked at the city through the window for a few minutes before opening my laptop and returning to the work that was waiting for me, the way it always was, the way it always would be. The partnership contract was renewed 6 weeks later under the new terms I had proposed. Daniel's signature was on it, below mine. I filed it in the appropriate folder and moved on to the next thing, the way I move through most things now, with the particular forward momentum of a person who has stopped waiting for anyone else to determine the direction. Meridian Solutions closed its first full quarter under my ownership 11% above the previous year's comparable period. I sent Gerald Holt a brief note with the numbers. He wrote back 2 lines. He said he had chosen well. He said he hoped I knew that. I wrote back 1 line. I told him I was beginning to. If someone walked out of your life and accidentally left the door open to something better, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe for the next one. This is Hidden Blood Revenge, where the quiet ones finally tell their side.